So my first slide is the definition of intimate partner violence and how it affects pregnancy and who it affects being the parent and the child. Intimate partner violence, or IPV, as you'll hear me say a lot, is a serious, preventable public health problem that affects millions of Americans. The term intimate partner violence describes physical violence, sexual violence, stalking, or psychological harm by a current or former partner or spouse. This type of violence can occur among heterosexual and homosexual couples and does not require sexual intimacy. So this doesn't necessarily mean that the person that you're with, I know in heterosexual and homosexual couples there are arrangements where two people have a child together. They're not really, they were at one point sexually intimate, they're not anymore, or they never were. My sister has a friend, they are 32 and 36. They see other people, but they had a child together. They've been friends forever. And they were like, you know what, there's no one else I want to have a kid with. So there's all different kinds of relationships, obviously, blended families, all that kind of stuff. But focused on intimate partner violence, it's just saying that it can occur between any relationship, platonic or sexual. Next, my citation, a research study conducted by Coker, Sanderson, and Dong regarding abuse during pregnancy and pregnancy outcomes was surveyed upon 755 women. 14% of those women, 14.7% of those women indicated that an intimate partner was violent or abusive toward them during their pregnancy. So that equals out to 274 of 1,862 pregnancies. And it might sound kind of minuscule, but that's 274 women. Yeah, women. They were pregnant at the time, or people who could become pregnant that were abused during their gestational period. Abuse during pregnancy was significantly associated with an increased risk of perinatal death and preterm low birth weight among those children who survived gestation. So they're either coming out with deficits or they're not even surviving gestation, which is, I don't even have to tell you how horrible that is. Greater abuse frequency was associated with an increased risk. So the more chances of abuse, or the more times that it occurred, means that those carrying the baby and the fetus itself were at an increased risk for these side effects. Through this study, we see that abuse during pregnancy was associated with perinatal deaths and premature low birth weight deliveries. So that's what I was referring to, the greater abuse frequency. So the more often that the abuse happens, that means that they're more likely linked with perinatal death and premature low birth weight deliveries. So I have some statistics on the slide. It's 1 in 3 women worldwide have experienced physical or sexual violence. That's 1 in 3 women. In a room with 10 women, 2 or 3 of them have been sexually abused or physically abused. Like, my God. 10% of women and 2% of men report having been stalked by an intimate partner, which is scary in itself because, it's the step before. About 1 in 5 women and 1 in 12 men have experienced contact sexual violence by an intimate partner, and 1 in 5 women and 1 in 7 men report having experienced severe physical violence from an intimate partner in their lifetime. So my next slide is the consequences to the caregiver and child. When I say caregiver, I predominantly mean the mother. I know there are some instances with men or people who identify as men. I didn't want to just say the mother or the female. So for that, we focus on the impact on a person's reproductive health. This was a study done by Leah Okenwa in 2016 on women, I believe, in Kenya. No, this was Nigeria. This was my Nigeria article. So, compared with women not exposed to IPV or intimate partner violence, those who were exhibited a higher likelihood of using modern forms of contraception, having a history of miscarriages, induced abortions, stillbirths, or infant mortality, and having many children. So the having many children, I personally, and from what I've read, it stems back to the whole being manipulated and being forced to stay, and you have to raise these kids with me because if you leave you're a bad mother, that whole mental psychological manipulation game that the perpetrator plays. Compared with women having history of miscarriages, stillbirths, infant mortality, that goes directly from the psychosomatics. They're abused during the pregnancy so that baby doesn't make it. They're so stressed, they're so anxious. The next line, women battered by IPV reported higher levels of anxiety and depression that often led to alcohol and drug abuse. When you're pregnant, you don't want anxiety, depression, alcohol, or drug abuse, so that's where that gets sticky. As I previously mentioned, violence on pregnant women significantly increased risk for low birth weight infants, preterm delivery, and neonatal death, and it also affected breastfeeding postpartum. So that is the second half of my slide, how it affects the child. Babies born with low birth weight may be more likely than babies born at a normal weight to have certain health conditions later in life. These include diabetes, heart disease, and high blood pressure. Yeah, I'm a nursing student for 3 years, and I know diabetes, heart disease, and high blood pressure leads to a myriad of other illnesses. So that might be what they get at first, but it doesn't mean that there's not going to be countless secondary chronic illnesses due to them. So right out of the bat, they haven't done anything wrong. They were just a fetus in a womb, and they're already behind because of the IPV. For infants, not being breastfed is associated with an increased incidence of infectious morbidity. You know, the colostrum, that's how you get your passive, naturally acquired immunity. It took me a minute. So when you don't get that colostrum the first time, you have an increased incidence of infectious morbidity, such as otitis media, gastroenteritis, and pneumonia, as well as elevated risks of childhood obesity, type 1 and type 2 diabetes, leukemia, and SIDS, sudden infant death syndrome. I know with the obesity and the diabetes, it's linked to like the sugar content, the sucralose in formula. So babies come out of the womb and they're addicted to sugar. You know how addictive sugar is. They say it's 8 times more addictive than cocaine. So just right off the bat, the mother not being able to breastfeed is already harming the child in a way that you would never even think of unless you had researched it, had some knowledge behind it. As you can see, the psychological effects on an individual experiencing IPV can lead to psychosomatic deficits, resulting in the mother and child facing less than optimal health conditions, which, being behind the starting line before you're even born, is obviously less than optimal. So that was from Okenwa in 2016. I have that cited. My next slide is the rates of incidences. So this is like who it affects, the percentages, statistics, all that stuff. I have one. It's not within 5 years, but it's 22.1% of all peoples in the United States have reported sexual, physical, or emotional abuse since 2000, which I know it was years ago, but that's 1 in 4 people since 2000 has been abused in some fashion, and I'm sure that number's higher. Probably like 50, 60. And then the second part is during the COVID-19 lockdown. Now, I work in a psychiatric facility, so I'm well aware of how the COVID-19 lockdown has led to domestic abuse quarrels. It's very scary. Since the coming of the new century, an average of 22.1% of people 18 and older involved with a romantic partner have experienced